It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce to you Steve Estey. Steve is the Interim National Coordinator at the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, whose motto is "A Voice of Our Own." Steve is a former human rights officer at Disabled Peoples International, DPI, a Canadian-based non-governmental organization that works globally to advance the human rights of persons with disabilities. From 2003 until the successful conclusion of the negotiations in 2006, Steve was advisor to the Canadian government delegation to the United Nations, which drafted the new Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. From 2007 to 2010, he led DPI's work to encourage the governments around the world to ratify the CRPD. Since leaving DPI in 2010, he has devoted his time to teaching and projects specifically aimed at the effective implementation of the CRPD and related to the full realization of human rights for people with disabilities. Currently, Steve leads us in civil society around the CRPD, and it's my great honor to welcome him to the stage.
Great. Thanks very much, Maureen. It's a real pleasure to be here today with you. I always say to Maureen that I'm happy to come to these conferences to talk about employment because the work that's been happening around employment in Canada is a real great example of how the CRPD can actually drive and move things forward. So this is the third conference that we've been around disability and work, and it follows after the first round of reporting on the CRPD. So that Canada did on the CRPD. So there have been talk about the convention over the course of the last couple of days, but I wanted to I wanted to drill down a little bit and say, we talk about how the CRPD talks about the right to work and things like that. But what I wanted to do is talk about the kind of process that we've gone through in terms of reporting around this and how that's kind of led to this discussion. So I'll talk for a few minutes, and then maybe we'll have a little bit of a question and answer session, depending on how we are for time and stuff, okay? So Canada ratified the convention in 2010, and that moved us into a process around working with the CRPD committee in terms of reporting on our implementation of the convention. So the Canadian government filed its initial report on the convention and how we're doing the implementation in 2014. And then in 2015, civil society began to respond to that. And what we did, first of all, was we submitted a bunch of questions that we wanted the committee to ask to Canada, and then we submitted a parallel report on that process. And then in 2017, the committee met with the Government of Canada and had a dialogue about implementation, and the committee issued a series of recommendations, were called concluding observations. That happened in 2017, in the early part of the year, and then it was in December of 2017 that the initial conference on disability and work took place. And I think that they're very much connected. These two things are connected. The work of the committee and then the kind of response of civil society in terms of setting up this process around working to develop a national strategy and so on. So I had to talk a little bit about how the kind of process evolved. If you look back at the initial government report in 2017, when you look at what they talked about around employment, and I mean, the convention is a whole series of different articles on different parts of human rights, and one of the articles talks specifically about the right to work or employment. That's Article 27. So if you look at the initial government report, and they talk about what the Canadian government was doing around the right to work, and the initial report talked about things like the Opportunities Fund, talked about labor market agreements and things. I just read a little piece here from the 2014 Government of Canada report. It says, through labor market agreements for persons with disabilities, or LMAPDs, The Government of Canada allocates $222 million annually to provinces and territories to design and deliver programs and services to increase employment opportunities for people with disabilities. A wide range of activities are supported under the LMAPDs, including pre-employment preparation, skills development, and post-secondary educational supports. So this is the kind of thing that you see in government reports. What they do is they go across the country and they pick out programs that respond to the obligations that they have, and that's what the reports tend to be, is a kind of a long list of government programs that exist to respond to things. But, over the course of the last couple of days here and in the previous two conferences, we've talked a lot about what really needs to happen to encourage employment for people with disabilities, and these LMAPDs are just the beginning of a process. They don't really actually fulfill the Government of Canada's obligations around this. So what we did in the process of responding to the government report is we put in a series of questions or suggestions that civil society organizations wanted the committee to ask to the Government of Canada. So one of the suggestions that we made in 2016 was as follows. It said that the federal government provides millions of dollars in wage subsidies through a variety of federal, provincial, and territorial agreements. Yet many who work in the field argue that these subsidies are not very effective in the long term. So we asked the committee to ask the government to explain what steps Canada is taking to evaluate the efficiency of wage subsidy programs for employment and retention of workers with disabilities. We also said, in recent years, significant cutbacks have taken place in terms of workers' compensation programs and financial supports across Canada. It's estimated that each year 50,000 workers in Canada are hurt seriously enough to rely on permanent disability support programs for their income. Approximately 20% of the 50,000 live in poverty, while another 25% live near poverty. So we asked again for the committee to ask Canada to please explain what steps Canada is taking to develop and implement national poverty alleviation strategy that includes specific measures to address poverty experienced by persons with disabilities, including injured workers. So that's a kind of back and forth that you have, the government talking about the programs that exist, and then civil society trying to drill down and say, well, yeah, you've got these programs, but where's that getting you? And then in our shadow report in 2016, we said again, the federal government provides millions of dollars in wage subsidies through a variety of labor market agreements. And we asked if Canada would initiate a robust evaluation of the effectiveness of wage subsidies to lessen the gap in employment rates between Canadians with disabilities and Canadians without disabilities. So these are the questions that we're wanting the committee to ask, and this led to a dialogue between the committee and the Government of Canada. And that dialogue took place in 2017. We traveled to Geneva, Government of Canada traveled to Geneva, civil society traveled as well, to have a discussion about how we're meeting our obligations and the kinds of things that we could do to respond to them, or the kinds of things that the Government of Canada was doing to meet our obligations, and how those could be better, how those could... The five threw me off, Dan, sorry. So we had this interactive dialogue in 2017, and from that, there were a series of recommendations that came, and I just wanted to share that with you, because I think that really, it shows you how we got ourselves here today. So the concluding observations, they say in 2017, the committee is concerned with the high number of unemployed persons with disabilities, as well as the lack of programs to retain jobs of persons with disabilities in periods of economic crisis. It is further concerned about the absence of strategies and models to ensure open labor market for persons with disabilities, in particular women and young persons with disabilities. The committee notes that there's a steady increase in both the number and proportion of complaints of discrimination in employment of persons with disabilities. And then they say the committee recommends that Canada adopt a strategy on employment of persons with disabilities, including Indigenous people with disabilities, that guarantees access to the labor market and promotes work in open, inclusive, and accessible environments, and equal opportunities and gender equality, and provides a reasonable accommodation. Finally, they say that the government and civil society need to develop strategies aimed at providing decent work opportunities for women and young persons with disabilities, including the provision of reasonable accommodation, flexible time arrangements, appropriate training, measures that prevent harassment and other forms of discrimination in the workplace. So you see then that we started off the government talking about the great things it does. We're trying to drill down and get into some details of that, back and forth from that, and then the committee talks about the need to develop a strategy. So we came from Geneva in 2017, Maureen and myself and a few other folks, and we had all of these suggestions of things that could be done. And I started off saying why I'm happy to be here at this conference, because this conference is a real tangible example of how civil society can actually rise to the occasion when the committee makes a recommendation. The committee said we need to develop a strategy around work for people with disabilities in Canada, and since that time, you folks have worked very hard over the course of 3 years to develop that very strategy, and I think that we're moving forward. And now, as we go into the second round of reporting, we can begin to talk further about that strategy in the context of the committee itself, and we can dialogue with the committee. And the final thing that I want to say, and I suspect that Tabitha is going to talk more about this later on today from the Human Rights Commission, but the final thing that I wanted to say is we've been doing all of this stuff at the UN at sort of 30,000 feet up, talking about strategies and things like that, all very high level. But interestingly and excitingly for me, now, with the passage of the ACA earlier this year, we're beginning to embark on a process not just of international monitoring of the convention, but also of domestic monitoring of the convention. So we can really get into some of the nuts and bolts of how these things are working, and we can do that in the context of human rights framework. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that's going to go forward, looking forward to see how that work in terms of the domestic monitoring is going to connect up with the work that you folks are doing on this strategy and things. So I'm going to leave it at that and hopefully open the floor for some questions and answers. Thanks very much.
Do we have questions for Steve at this time? So we've got Steve in the front, and then we've got, I can't see who's in the back, but we've got two, and then we'll go from there. And John, I see your hand as well.
Steve Mantis with the Ontario Network of Injured Workers Groups. I want to say thanks, Steve, for the presentation and for the support that you've provided to us in the development of our own submission to the United Nations CRPD. And building on your kind of closing comments, we have seen a number of advantages come from that process. Number one was linking up with the initiative the efforts that you're doing. Number two was we got a lot of media coverage about the issue we were putting forth, which was addressing that poverty issue with injured workers with permanent impairments. We also got the opportunity to take our submission and put it into an academic journal where it reaches a whole new audience. And we have been invited to a number of events to talk about our submission. And 2 weeks ago, in meetings with government officials, they were responding to some of the concerns we raised in our submission. So there's a number of byproducts from the work that you've been doing, and I want to thank you so much about that. And if there are other ways that we can use this work to increase awareness and action.
Thanks for your comment, Steve. To just respond to that, I think you're quite right that there are a number of different ways that we can use this process. And as I mentioned at the end of my comments, we're just beginning to look at domestic reporting on the convention. And I'm not sure how that's going to look. But one of the challenges, and you'll be aware of it, Steve, and others are aware of it, one of the challenges with the reporting process is that it's very compact. We have 33 operative articles in the convention talking about the whole range of human rights, and that gets reported across 13 jurisdictions. And the report itself can only be 10,000 words long. So it's very difficult to get at a lot of the really detailed things. We talk about injured workers in this context. That's a small part of what happens in terms of the right to work and employment and so on. And we haven't had the opportunity in the international reporting to really do this justice. And I'm hoping that as we move forward with the domestic reporting over time, we'll have a lot more opportunity to really drill down and get more into details and stuff. So thanks very much for your comments.
Thanks. We have a question in the back.
Question in the back.
Yep.
Carlos Sosa. I attended some of the meetings in 2016, even 2015, around the report here in Ottawa, and I found attending those meetings allowed us to give a lot of voice to a lot of issues that government doesn't normally really think about. So one of my other questions is how can labor be involved in this current CRPD reporting process? Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Carlos. Labor has been involved in some of the shadow reporting process. People from the CLC have been involved in meetings and so on. And I would also note that the labor movement has supported civil society to participate, to travel to Geneva and so on. So that's been a very helpful thing. I have had the opportunity to speak at a couple of labor conferences about the shadow reporting, and the CLC and others are certainly aware of it and engaged, and we invite them to continue to participate in it. And I would say again, and I'm beginning to sound like a bit of a broken record here, I realize, but I really think that as we move to the domestic monitoring, there will be an even greater opportunity for labor to engage in things. So I would encourage you and other folks in the trade union movement here in the room to be very aware of what's going on in terms of moving forward on domestic reporting around the convention.
Thank you. Kathy has reminded me that Slido is up. If you've got a question that you are not 100% confident or sure that I'm even going to see your hand, please feel free that to use the Slido if you'd like to. We do have two hands that I've seen from the floor. The first one is up here with John Ray. If we can run the mic up here. Nope. The mic is being run to you. Can you put your hand up, John? Perfect, thank you. And then we've got, I see another question over here to my right.
Steve, you spoke about the controversial question of wage subsidies and the notion that Canada should do a report evaluating their success or failure. Can you tell us whether that report, has anyone done such a report? And if so, how do we get it? Because it's a document I think many of us would be interested in seeing.
Thanks for your question, John. I was actually expecting something much harder to deal with, so I appreciate you being nice to me. As I understand it, as far as I know, there wasn't any uptake on this wage subsidy thing in the initial, in the response from government, and there hasn't been any follow-up on it. But we're in a rotational reporting process, and we can certainly bring this up again as we move forward. So if this is something that you're interested in and that other people are interested in, then we can come back to it as we move forward, okay? Thanks.
I'm just going to add as well that there is research being done that is being led by I'm not sure if it's the Institute for Work and Health or if it's the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy around wage subsidy, that there is some independent research being done, but it has not been undertaken by the Canadian government at this time. And John has just said that whoever's doing it would be good to see it, and absolutely. And then there's another question over here.
Hey there, Steve. Jason Michelle here. It's been a long time. We'll have to catch up later. My question is regarding the optional protocol that Canada has recently signed on to. What impact, if any, do you think that will have on the advancement of disability and workers' rights in Canada?
Hi, Jason. It's nice to see you. It's a good question. We've actually just been going across the country talking with folks about the optional protocol. You're quite right. Canada acceded to the optional protocol in January of this year. And for folks who don't know, the optional protocol is a process whereby you can bring an individual complaint before the committee, and that can be an individual case of discrimination, or it can be a case of systemic discrimination. So there are those two tracks, and at this point we haven't seen anything move forward in Canada, but it does offer the opportunity to have the committee review cases of discrimination where people have gone through the process here in Canada and not been able to satisfy themselves. So I think it is an avenue that may offer some opportunity, and we'll just have to see how it unfolds over time. But I was certainly quite pleased to see that Canada did accede to the optional protocol. Now it's sort of fully compliant with the CRPD, or we have all of the tools in place. So we use that and move forward with it and see how it goes.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, if there is one more question? No? Steve is quite a good presenter and usually answers your questions before you even know you have one. Oh, Aaron, over here in the middle. Yep, it's being run to you.
Okay.
I'm sort of hesitant to ask this question, but I'll ask it anyways. And maybe it's more of a comment than a question, but I'll do it anyways. There's a bunch of issues in terms of the things you're talking about. There have been huge issues in terms of LMAPD reports in terms of consistency. So you can get the LMAPD reports by province, and you'll see that every province wants to say things their own way without consistency, and there's been drives on the part of the federal government forever and ever to try to get that consistency with very limited success. And it's really, to my mind, and there's another issue when CCD does their thing. When we're talking about targeted wage subsidies, I did a lot of work on targeted wage subsidies over the years, and targeted wage subsidies, in the work that I did, have a place, and they work in conjunction, often with respect to other types of interventions. So if they're a cumulative thing in terms of the last step, in terms of adapting people, having the employer and the person with disabilities as an adaptive process along with other stuff, they're very effective because it costs an employer money to have that person there, and sometimes it's remedial, sometimes, not always, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. To come up with a great big generality about targeted wage subsidies working or not working is highly problematic. And it sort of comes back to a question about context. We need that context. We need consistency in terms of reporting that satisfies general goals, but also has to be understanding and contextual to the types of things that occur when you go through and evolve a program. So that's a comment more than a question, but if you want to respond to that, that would be great.
Great, thank you.
But it's an interesting comment, and I just wanted to respond to you and say that for me, as someone who's been involved in this stuff for a long time, the whole reporting process is an interesting one because governments, as you say, it sort of put their best foot forward on these things. And then before there was a convention, that happened, governments put their best foot forward, and disability organizations might be able to, do an op-ed or something like that, and that would be the end of it. But with this UN process, then you have a whole formalized process where governments actually have to focus on putting their best foot forward, but then there's a mechanism for civil society organizations, disability organizations, to respond to that outside of the Canadian context, and to talk with experts from other countries about this, to have a dialogue and so on. We've been talking about the CRPD. The CRPD is a very new convention in the UN context. I mean, there are conventions and covenants that have been out there for 40 or 50 years, and they have maybe been reported on and back and forth dialogue 5, 10 times over the course of that time. And what you see with those conventions, like the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, those kinds of treaties, you see over time a gradual movement. And I guess in my head, what I'm hoping for is a gradual movement on these kinds of things. So to trace it back to the employment piece again, you're right, there's lots of issues around LMAPDs and all other kinds of things. But I would say that despite the fact that those issues are there, it has created a process that has brought us together in this room to develop strategies and so on. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting to you, and I would never suggest to you, that this process is a perfect one. My suggestion is that it offers us an opportunity to come together as a community in ways that we haven't had before, and that's why I spend my time doing it. So, there you go.
So